Jesus teaches the principle of investment. Invest for a profit. Both principles we must live by in order for us to live in a challenging society like ours. Let's pray for wisdom tonight, that we will gain some information that will help us live better lives in our economy. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the opportunity of gathering knowledge. We believe, Lord, that you have endowed men with the opportunity to seek knowledge and to pass on to those who require it. You've asked of us that we must seek wisdom. And Lord, we are here tonight in search of wisdom to face the challenges that are ever changing before us. We ask, Lord, that the information that will be shared this evening, that we will, oh God, be able to use it for the betterment of ourselves and our people. I ask for your blessing upon the presenter. And I thank you for those who facilitated his coming here, that in these parts we could not only hear, but deduce certain things that we require for the continual upliftment of our community. Bless tonight's proceedings. Bless every ear and cause every mind to work towards doing that which you have called us to do. And Daddy God, at the end of the exercise, we will be mindful to give you thanks and praise and glory and honor. And all God's people say, amen. Thank you.
Your Excellency, the President of the Commonwealth of Dominica, Mr. Eliud Williams and Mrs. Williams, Dr. Francis Severin, I should say soon to be director of the Open Country campus sites of the Open Campus of the University of the West Indies, Mrs. Susan Piper, Marketing Manager, National Bank of Dominica, who is deputizing here for the manager of the National Bank of Dominica. Our feature speaker, Mr. Donald, preferred to call himself Danny Roberts, but Donald U. Roberts. He is the head of the Shearer. I see the abbreviation here, so I need to take that very slowly. He's the head of the Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute of the University of Mona, and with a particular propensity, you may say, for the open campus, all part of the family. Pastor Randy Rodney, who, as I said, invoked the presence of God, and the rain has stopped. Pastor Rodney, I hope that we will get many more persons to attend here. Ms. Kimon Joseph, Marketing and Outreach Officer, University of West Indies Open Campus, Dominica site. Staff of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, Dominica, and the staff of the National Bank of Dominica. Other distinguished guests, friends, families, and the media playing a key role here tonight. We all know why we're here, and we also note that the University of the West Indies Open Campus attracts always for its distinguished lecture a large crowd. But like most Caribbean things, people will filter in with time. I have not seen some of the familiar faces, but I know they will be here. At this juncture, I would like to call on Mrs. Susan Piper, Marketing Manager, National Bank of Dominica Limited, to give welcome remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Good evening to everyone. This year, I have the pleasure of welcoming you here to listen to the 6th annual NBD UE Open Campus National Distinguished Lecture. For those of you who've been here before, in past years, you have looked forward to Dr. Severin's discourse at this juncture in the program. I will not attempt to outdo or even match Dr. Severin, so mine will be short and sweet. On behalf of the UE Open Campus and the National Bank of Dominica Limited, I'd like to extend welcome to His Excellency, the President, Mr. Eliud Williams, and Mrs. Williams, Pastor Randy Rodney, members of the audience, the media and listeners of Kyrie FM, and of course the officials of the UE Open Campus and the NBD. May I take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us here this evening. This evening promises to be as engaging as previous lectures. Mr. Danny Roberts, head of the Hugh Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute, will be presenting on the topic, Globalism and the Challenges of Labor, Prescriptions for Regional Competitiveness. I am especially honored to welcome Mr. Danny Roberts. We thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation to come and to share your perspective on this topic. Tonight's event is the 6th of a series of lectures hosted by the UE Open Campus Dominica and the National Bank of Dominica Limited, NBD. These two organizations have enjoyed a healthy and rewarding partnership in hosting these lectures. This lecture series was introduced in 2008 when we explored the topic, Banks as Financiers in Small Island Economies, Where Does Development Fit? Since then, we have explored some poignant topics such as Pan-African consciousness in Caribbean popular culture, and that was delivered by Professor Carolyn Cooper, Professor of the Literary and Cultural Studies, Faculty of Humanities and Education in the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Ms. Tracy Robinson, Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Law at UE Caville campus, delivered on Family Laws Institutions in Transition, Rights, Rhetoric, and Reform. And last year, we heard from Professor Carl Theodore, Director of the Health Economics Unit, Center of Health Economics at UE St. Augustine, on social security and Caribbean economic development. As an Indigenous bank, it is our pleasure to collaborate with our own Indigenous institution, educational institution, the UE Open Campus Dominica, in bringing quality non-formal education to the people of Dominica. It is our hope that we can continue to cultivate this culture of open discussion and analysis. This evening's topic, Globalism and the Challenges of Labor, Prescriptions for Regional Competitiveness, we will all agree is timely, as for years now, we are being challenged to look beyond narrow workplace concerns in order to more assertively address the broader social and environmental issues of our times that can limit our economic growth. You can look forward to an engaging presentation, which we hope will be followed by the usual lively discussion. So on behalf, again, of the UE Open Campus and NBD, I want to welcome our lecturer for tonight, Mr. Danny Roberts, and all of you in the audience for joining us. We hope you have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
And let me say thank you to you, Mrs. Susan Piper. And again, you gave the feeling that this is 6 years of partnership and that there are many more 6 years to come. We will take them in dozens. When we have reached the 12th distinguished lecture of the NBD, I think possibly Dr. Severin will have some shares in this bank as a worthy partner that should, for posterity, continue that partnership. It's opportune now, as I said in my short remarks at the start in salutations, to invite Dr. Francis Severin, Director Designate of the UWI Open Campus, not of just Dominica, of the entire campus, UWI campus. He will be installed come October of this year. Dr. Francis Severin to address you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for your kind introduction. And Mrs. Piper, you are in fact modest. I think you have outdone me already, and so I should try to follow in your footsteps. Your Excellency, the President, Mr. Eliud T. Williams and Mrs. Williams, our distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Donald Hugh Roberts, who is the head of the Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute, Mrs. Susan Piper, Marketing Manager, National Bank of Dominica Limited, Mr. Felix Wilson, Acting Head, UWI Open Campus Dominica, Ms. Kimon Joseph, Marketing and Outreach Officer, UWI Open Campus Dominica, Mr. Randy Rodney, Pastor, Trinity Baptist Church, my son in whom I'm well pleased, members of the Board of Directors and staff of the National Bank of Dominica Limited and staff of the UWI Open Campus Dominica, members of the audience, and I also recognize the President of the Guild of Students of the Open Campus, and members of the media. Time races on, and how good and wonderful it is that both the National Bank of Dominica Limited and the University of the West Indies Open Campus Dominica can celebrate another highlight in our collaboration by staging tonight our 6th annual NBD UWI Open Campus Distinguished National Lecture. In that regard, allow me to extend immediately the university's kind thanks to the Board of Directors, the General Manager, and the staff of the National Bank of Dominica. We launched this lecture series when, in 2008, our institutions, which I like to refer to as indigenous, were observing their respective anniversaries. In the case of the NBD, it was 30 years, and in the case of the UWI, in 2008, it was 60 years. Tonight, we look forward with alacrity to hearing from Mr. Donald Hugh Roberts, the head of the Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute, Consortium for Social Development and Research of the Open Campus, on the topic, Globalism and the Challenges of Labor, Prescriptions for Regional Competitiveness. Danny, as we popularly know him, has asked me to say to you that the U in his name has nothing to do with Lawson Shearer. We hold this lecture against a backdrop of severe global economic reverse that threatens our Caribbean, our people, and our institutions at their very foundations. The working class, who otherwise would have managed to lead reasonable lives, find themselves teetering on the brink of poverty with nothing in their arsenal of experience to have prepared them for such mounting challenges. Alongside this process is a further driving into the ground, to all intents and purposes, literally, of the poor. We are facing hard times in the Caribbean and the world. How we continue to survive is indeed a marvel. Ladies and gentlemen, at the Academy, we like to inform people. Indeed, this is our mission. We hope tonight we may further disaggregate, deconstruct, and isolate the fundamental issues in the phenomenon globalism and how it has negatively impacted labor. We hope to ascertain how our human resources can be effectively and efficiently pitted against the crisis. And we hope to learn how, with our restricted monetary resources, we may employ rather than exploit our human capital to make us competitive. In other words, we look forward with eagerness to this non-formal education tonight, brought to us by the collaboration of two local institutions, the National Bank of Dominica Limited and the University of the West Indies, Open Campus, Dominica. I wish to take this opportunity to say here that later this year, the Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute of the UWI Open Campus, the Department of Management Studies, UWI MONA, and the Open Campus Dominica are planning a training workshop on reinventing collective bargaining in the public sector. We are presently contacting a number of stakeholders, and the response so far is encouraging, but we need many more on board. The purpose of the workshop later this year is to introduce to the key players in the public and private sectors a new model in collective bargaining negotiation which radically departs from the current adversarial and protracted approach with all the attendant challenges to our government's overall fiscal responsibility and the workers' desire for improvement in their living standards. This new model, known as interest-based bargaining, IBB, provides an opportunity for both parties to engage in constructive dialogue within an established protocol framework to ensure an outcome which would be desirable to all stakeholders. Hence, in the present crisis, we will gain nothing at going at each other's throats. Reasoned dialogue is the way to go. The profound saying by President Benjamin Franklin, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately," is apt here. These lecture series have also been a relationship with the Fort Young Hotel, which has accommodated us so efficiently on all occasions. The Fort Young has given us full complimentary use of the conference room for all public lectures for 2013. That is, all 4 of our scheduled lectures, plus a public lecture, which was mounted in collaboration with NBD and ECCB on April 2, 2013. As I say so, I want to recognize in the audience the new resident rep of the ECCB local agency office, Ms. Shearer John. We thank the management and staff, especially the event staff of the Fort Young Hotel, for their efficient services. We do not take for granted or overlook our collaboration with the media either. It is important for me to record my personal gratitude to the media houses, which understand the overall national boon of educating our people. I salute the media for helping the NBD and the UWI to reach out to our people in Dominica and the diaspora. We dedicate this event to you, the people of Dominica, who are interested in your own intellectual development and generally yearn for knowledge. I do believe in the abundance of knowledge, only the fool remains ignorant. Happily, we do not belong to the group of people who make it a hobby to lean on their own misunderstanding. We sincerely hope that as more of such fora are mounted, an educational and intellectual receptiveness and culture will be stimulated and reinforced in Dominica so that our population increasingly becomes one that engages or encourages deep thought, reflection, analysis, and debate. Indeed, perhaps more importantly, we hope to become more tolerant of the opinions of others, even when they do not coincide with ours. Fundamentally, we want to encourage thinking in our society. Former UWI Vice Chancellor, Professor the Honorable Rex Nettleford, a prominent trade unionist himself, expressed this in a different way on Saturday, March 6, 1999, at his installation address. He said, quote, "What is impatient of debate is the logical priority that the capacity to think must have over all other capacities, since every human act, from keeping within a budget to handling people, is an act of intelligence. And in the knowledge economy, the future lies with the intelligent. Unless people in our region can approach all the information in the global information society with the ability to analyze, select, and incorporate relevant parts into the existing knowledge base, we may as well be content with being hewers of wood and drawers of water while the thinking is done elsewhere. The university as an institution of growth and an instrument of developing mastery of our destiny is clearly here for good reason, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to have you again in our physical and virtual audience. In particular, I wish to thank my colleague on your behalf for traveling all the way from Jamaica, land we love, he would say, to have this conversation with us this evening. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Francis Severin. As chair, I think I can be given the largesse to invite someone who made it his duty to be here with us, although he feared that leave Ireland anytime may not get him here on time. But we all recognize when he walked in, Mr. Michael Bird. He's Jamaican by birth, I would think, and he would like to say a few things on behalf of the National Bank, even if Mrs. Piper has already addressed as the head of the National Bank manager. But you being here, I would like to invite you to just say a few words, because we need to continue that partnership. Thank you, Mr. Bill.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency. The partnership is a strong thing, and we are committed on our side to keep the partnership going. And you know, as I heard on the radio as I was driving down the 6 and 12, yeah, we are committed to that. So we are thankful and look forward to keep on sponsoring and co-sponsoring this event. The topic will be insightful, and you know, it speaks to regionalization and globalization. And you know, I just got off the plane, and one of the things that we're looking at in the banking sector is how do we deal with globalization and regionalization from the perspective that a small bank, it's very hard to compete against banks, be it the other banks that are here on the island, in the region, around the world. And you know, I was just visiting 2 of our neighboring countries, and you know, we're looking at, you know, how can we as an institution spread and gain synergies across the region to become that much more stronger, that much more efficient. So those are the things that you also apply in the banking arena, where we have to look out into the world, and because it's changing, it's different. So you know, I spent the last few days looking at the ways that we can work with other indigenous banks in our region to become that much stronger and probably equally important, that much more efficient. So I welcome our speaker from our homeland, and we all, I think, on behalf of the whole audience, look forward to insightful discussion after your comments. So welcome, and thank you.
Mr. Bird, thank you. I didn't ask if you attended the University of West Indies Mona campus, but impromptu speaking is what we promote at the University of West Indies. And you, being born in Jamaica, at least the breeze of Mona would have passed over you. And that, I think, what you have just done was very commendable. Thank you. You also may not know, within your bank, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, that the indigenous bank, the National Bank of Dominica, is strategizing to have deeper relationship with the University of the West Indies Open Campus Dominica site. And hopefully that model, if it comes through, will be marketed to the other open campus sites around the region. So we're looking forward to that deeper partnership, which will go well beyond distinguished lectures, well beyond talk, you may say, to the meet. At this point, I would like to give a brief biography. Dr. Sevre, you struck on something that you didn't realize is true. I just was told by our guest speaker that the U came from a former registrar of the University of the West Indies, Hugh Springer, okay? And that is where his parents baptized him with that name, middle name, Hugh. So he, Danny Roberts, CD, Justice of Peace, is the head of the Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute at the Consortium for Social Development and Research at the Open Campus of the University of the West Indies, MONA. An African, Caribbean, Pacific European Economic Community, ACPEEC scholar, Mr. Roberts is a graduate of the University of the West Indies with a BA honors in communications with social sciences and a Master of Philosophy, MPhil in government. He was the recipient of the Jamaica 4th highest national honors in 2009, the commander of the Order of Distinction, CD, for his contribution to the trade union movement, and was appointed a Justice of Peace from St. Andrews in 2011. Mr. Roberts has spent more than 20 years in the trade union movement, serving as president of the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions Youth Committee, vice president of the National Workers Union, and president of the Union of Clerical, Administrative, and Supervisory Employees. He currently serves as the vice president of the umbrella trade union organization, the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions. Mr. Roberts has authored a number of books, chapters, and has written and presented dozens of papers on industrial relations, trade unionism, labor market issues, and aspects of labor studies at workshops, conferences, and seminars locally and regionally. He is a co-host of News Talk 93, a morning program, radio program, Jamaica Speaks, or probably in Jamaican lingo, Jamaica Talk. He also serves on a variety of committees, including the Minimum Wage Advisory Commission, the Labor Advisory Committee, the National Council on Education, and the Jamaica Productivity Center. Mr. Roberts has been a newspaper columnist, radio commentator, television analyst, and currently writes a monthly column for the Jamaica Herald newspaper. Mr. Roberts is married to Geraldine and has two daughters, Cherise and Sasha Kay. And you see, that ends his biography, where it started with his wife and two ladies. So you're surrounded. I feel for you. I have two sons and one daughter, okay? You should read my articles of books to have this son into your family. But welcome to Dominica, and ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our guest speaker for the night, Donald U. Roberts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those, should I say, kind words of introduction. His Excellency, the President, Mr. Eliud Williams and Mrs. Williams, Dr. Francis Severin, the Director of the Open Campus Countryside, Mrs. Susan Piper, the Marketing Manager, of the National Bank of Dominica, my compatriot Michael Bird, General Manager of NDB, but we're all Caribbean people, so there's no great distinction to be made. Ms. Kimoon Joseph, Marketing and Outreach Officer of the UWI Open Campus. Mr. Rodney, Pastor of the Trinity Baptist Church. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all just thank you for the very warm welcome on my first visit to Dominica. And although I came at 10 o'clock last night, I did enjoy the drive through the country parts. Noticed the development taking place, the road construction. Got a little taken in by the mountainous weather, the sun and the rainforest, and really did enjoy it. And I'm leaving tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to see much more of that natural beauty that is so much a part of Dominica. But next time, I'll be back certainly much longer. I'd also like to thank the National Bank of Dominica and the University of the West Indies Open Campus for the privilege that you have afforded me to deliver this sixth distinguished lecture. And I didn't realize the kind of expectation that has been placed certainly on me to deliver the kind of lecture that hopefully can stimulate a lively discussion thereafter. But as usual, as we as Caribbean peoples always give things our best shot. So here goes. We live in a region whose past history has been shaped, perhaps more than any other, by the evolution of a global economy. Clive Thomas, who was a George Beckford Professor of Caribbean Economy at the University of the West Indies, said that the Caribbean was the nursery in which many of the original elements of global capitalism and the world market were nurtured. Indeed, the plantation, which came to dominate Caribbean societies for nearly 500 years, in many respects bears the prototype of the elemental characteristics of modern-day globalization. And any objective analysis of the historical continuities to the present global situation would recognize the significance of labor, more expressly, the exploitation of that labor as central to the hegemonic influences of the times. An understanding, therefore, of the challenges to regional development in the context of globalization must firstly recognize this global phenomenon as representing what is called intellectual hegemony, an instrument to be used for global domination, where the powerful countries, in words so eloquently expressed by Sir Sridhar Ramphal, instinctively take from globalization what it offers in enhancement of their power, but deny its potential for enhancement of the power of others. And secondly, for us as a region to develop what Norman Gervon calls counter-globalization strategies, which would change the trajectory from labor exploitation to labor empowerment as an alternative development paradigm consistent with the needs and interests of our people. This is important if we are to correct the mischief of the past, in which the history of Caribbean labor has in fact been a history of exploitation. Gervon postulates that globalization, in its ideological usage, is the label employed for the post-Cold War US-led project of the 1990s to organize the world according to the principles of neoliberal economics. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, attempts were made to relegate ideology to the dustbin of history. But the key aspects of globalization to bring about standardization and uniformity in thinking regarding the world economic system, the development process, and the prescriptions and strategies for action, label it an ideology. The ideology of globalization is globalism. Globalism refers to a national geopolitical policy in which the world is seen as a proper sphere for one nation to project political influence. Conservapedia defines it as, and I quote, the failed liberal authoritarian desire for a one world view that rejects the important role of nations in protecting values and promoting productivity, end of quote. This distinction is often made between globalism, as defined above, and globalization, which is seen as a process or transformation of local or regional phenomena into global ones. The process is usually a combination of economic, sociocultural, technological, and political considerations. In his book, Globalism, the New Market Ideology, Professor Manfred Steger noted that globalism, and I quote, diminishes the capacity of human beings to participate in shaping their destinies and live in dignity and relative material security, end of quote. He sees it as constituting little more than a gigantic repackaging of old laissez-faire ideas. The essence of his work points to what he describes as that knobby intersection where trade, politics, and social norms just for dominance, and how within that space neoliberals have employed ideology to promote their private interests as public goods. In adopting what social scientists call critical discourse analysis, I therefore begin with an approach to the topic based on dissident research, which decidedly rejects the globalizing ideology and therefore set about to help us clearly understand, expose, and ultimately resist the inequality and exploitative nature of this ideology, which is based on the notion that unregulated capitalism is the inevitable, inescapable fate of successful economies. And I do so from a labor perspective, because we cannot envisage a Caribbean future of development and prosperity through greater competitiveness if we continue to interpret the path from past to present, from slavery to globalization, as one in which the control and dominance of labor, and not its empowerment and equality, is the quintessence of economic prosperity. In a global economy lecture in 2007, hosted by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, Robert Feenstra from the University of California, in a paper on globalization and its impact on labor, spoke about the effects of globalization and free trade on wages, outsourcing, the mobility of labor, and productivity. Certainly for the last 10 years, in both developed and developing countries, we have witnessed rising wage inequalities and a stagnation of real wage growth. A point made by Raphael Kaplinsky in his paper, Globalization, Poverty and Inequality Between a Rock and a Hard Place, in which he argues that the rise in global poverty and globalization are relational. The January 18, 2007 edition of The Economist noted that the promise of globalization to improve the lot of humanity has actually resulted in a historic fall in labor's share of GDP globally, with not only blue-collar workers, but the wider office-working middle class shuffling along, grimly waiting for the next round of cost cuts. A 2004 ILO report stated that, and I quote, "The quality of work is the litmus test for the success or failure of globalization and the source of dignity, stability, peace, and credibility of governments and the economic system." End of quote. Even where globalization has resulted in improved productivity, this has not led to lower prices of goods and services and higher real wages for workers. Part of the narrative which therefore underpins the concept of globalism is the belief that markets are efficient, that financial innovation transfers risk to those most able to deal with it, that self-regulation works best, and that government's intervention is ineffective and harmful. Denai Roderick, who is a professor of political economy at Harvard University, identifies what he calls the triangulatory problems of globalization. The trilemma, according to Professor Roderick, is that, and I quote, "We cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national development, and economic globalization. One of the three has to give if the others are to succeed." End of quote. In his book on "Has Globalization Gone Too Far?", Professor Roderick points to the dangers which are inherent if the social consequences of globalization are ignored. He mentions the backlash against trade and, more importantly, the social disintegration as nations are split along lines of economic status, mobility, region, or social norms. There is now a new communitarian movement brought about by the absence in globalization of moral and civic virtues, and inherently suspicious of the benefits to be derived from market expansion. The ILO, while acknowledging that the process of economic cooperation and integration has helped a number of countries to benefit from high rates of economic growth and employment creation, points to the fact that many countries are facing major challenges of income inequality, continuing high levels of unemployment and poverty, vulnerability of economies to external shocks, and the growth of both protected work and informal economy, which has substantially impacted the employment relationship. Public opinion polls continue to show negative views of the impact of globalization on the labor market. An ILO publication entitled "A Fair Globalization, Creating Opportunities for All" noted that, and I quote, "The current path of globalization must change. Too few share in its benefits. Too many have no voice in its design and no influence on its course." End of quote. The governance of globalization is certainly not founded on ethical considerations of universally shared values and respect for human rights. Market success and failure tend to become the ultimate standard of behavior, and the attitude of winner takes all undermines the fabric of social cohesion and sustainable development. This is what led to the collapse of the Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh, which killed over 1,000 persons. A US $20 billion a year business, which accounts for 77% of Bangladesh's export, and where the cost of making a denim shirt in the United States is US $13.22, while in Bangladesh it is $3.72. an editorial in the Daily Star, a newspaper in Bangladesh, said, and I quote, that garment manufacturers have convoluted the idea of competitive and cheap, and workers are bearing the brunt of this. End of quote. Here in the region, we are now seized with the task of reconfiguring the matrix of Caribbean development. That task has become even more formidable, for according to Kenneth Hall and Dennis Ben, in their edited book, Contending with Destinies, the Caribbean in the 21st Century, while on the one hand, we seek to formulate national and regional policies and strategies designed to accelerate the pace of development, to promote social stability, and to nurture its creativity, the phenomena of globalization and liberalization appear to threaten our sovereignty and independence and undermine the authority of elected governments. Nettleford puts it starkly when he said the Caribbean, and I quote, is currently poised between a historical definition of its reality and the possibility of a redefinition of its geographical, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. End of quote. The ideological sweep of globalization on this continuum of European and US hegemony and its primordial influence over and control of labor is to both deprive the worker of voice at the workplace and to obliterate any Caribbean intellectual tradition which, according to Banislav Gosevic, a former UNCTAD representative, could provide meaningful dissent or alternative thinking which could challenge or engender doubts about the prevailing order and the systemic relationship underpinning globalization. The theory of the plantation economy model developed by Best and Levitt in another era would have represented meaningful dissent or alternative thinking emanating from the region. That plantation economy theory, a seminal work of the New World group of Caribbean thinkers, was located within the context of the critical discourse on global capitalism and neoliberalism, which drew the conclusion from Professor Gervon that as part of the counter-globalization concept, the plantation economy theory must be revisited. At the heart of that theory, we must recall, is the legitimate claim of the peoples of the Caribbean to charting their own destiny, and in the words of Frantz Fanon, crystallizing their innermost hopes. Central to that, of course, would have been the expressions which not only guarantee workers the right to organize and act in concert in defense of their interest, but equally importantly, that which guarantees them a voice at the workplace as part of the decision-making process. As Caribbean peoples, we need to be clear that we do not live in a de-ideologized world, and we must continue to struggle to ensure that we too have a set of shared ideas, beliefs, norms, and values that can be codified by our people and reflect the complexities of our Caribbean experience. If we move along that trajectory, from slavery through to colonialism, or from Columbus to Castro, we become acutely aware of the heritage of exploitation and neglect of labor in the Caribbean. A former British Prime Minister, Lord George, called the then British West Indies the slum of the empire. And Professor Macmillan of South Africa wrote some years ago that a study of West Indian islands is necessarily a study of poverty. Dr. Eric Williams, more than 40 years ago, remarked that we were the pawns of Europe and the United States, and saw as the great need of our time the closer collaboration among the various countries of the Caribbean. He said back in 1969, that dependence on the outside world in the Caribbean was not only economic, it is also cultural, institutional, intellectual, and psychological. Political forms and social institutions, even in the politically independent countries, William said, were imitated rather than created, borrowed rather than relevant, reflecting the forms existing in the particular metropolitan country from which they were derived. There is still no serious indigenous intellectual life. The ideological formulations, for the most part, still reflect the concepts and vocabulary of 19th century Europe, and more sinister, of the now almost defunct Cold War. End of. It is therefore important for us to recognize that what is both common and decisive in the resistance to both slavery and colonialism was the struggle from the people below, either because of the depressingly dehumanizing conditions of our labor under slavery, or the depressingly low levels of wages and living conditions of our workers under colonialism. If we therefore draw a parallel on that ideological continuum with its total institutional concept, what is therefore reflected in our contemporary experience would be the settlement of big businesses in the region, often at the expense of local companies, the conquest of our cultural sensibilities to legitimize lifestyles which are wayward and morally wrong, and the exploitation of our labor, while we yet again, from the time of the Gilded Age to today's global recession, carry on this cyclical romance with that discredited utopian view that unfettered market are both the essence of human liberty and the most expedient route to prosperity. True, the rapid growth of offshore financial markets, the restructuring of international competitiveness, the acceleration of technological change and deregulation, the management of global corporate activity, and the internationalization of production have all defined the concept of globalization, and to varying degrees have weakened the ability of individual Caribbean states to control the behavior of economic actors and have pushed the boundaries of policy making into the sphere of the global rather than the national or the regional. But not even the prevailing concept of a new regionalism beyond the classical integration theory which emerged in recent times in Europe and Asia and emphasizes the social, political, and cultural dimensions are matters of consideration or contemplation by us in the region. Bjorn Etne identified two types of regionalism, what he calls core regions, which are politically stable and economically dynamic, organized for the sake of better able to control the world, and peripheral regions, politically more turbulent and economically more stagnant, so they are organized to arrest a process of marginalization. At the same time, their regional arrangements are fragile and ineffective. The region, despite the years and effort it seems, can make no justifiable claim to have moved beyond the periphery. The integration process is now largely extroverted and driven by the tenets of globalization. But at the heart of the region's survival are really issues pertinent to productivity and competitiveness. And concomitant with that would be matters relevant to wage premium, job security, labor market, and the role of trade unions. That is to say, matters relevant to labor. In a paper on Caribbean labor market challenges and policies in 2006, Professor Andrew Downs identified the impact of globalization on Caribbean labor markets as resulting in the following. 1, low rate of labor force growth and the aging of the population. 2, gradual increase in the female participation rate. 3, general improvement in the educational attainment of those entering the labor market. 4, growth of the self-oriented workforce. 5, the slow growth of formal sector employment associated with the slowing down of Caribbean economies. 6, the growth in the number of self-employed persons associated with the increase in small and micro enterprises and also the informal sector. And 7, high levels of employment, especially among young females. And 8, a less militant role of the trade unions in the labor market. He spoke of the decline in competitiveness, which has adversely affected export growth and employment in the region. In addition, we have seen a decline in unionization associated with the global trend, privatization and trade liberalization leading to job losses, decline in the number of businesses because of a lack of competitiveness, and greater demand for skilled workers at the expense of unskilled workers. While foreign direct investments in countries like Barbados, Jamaica, and the OECS countries have contributed to job creation, these in many instances have been offset by job losses in the manufacturing sector, especially in Jamaica, owing to trade liberalization. We have also seen a rise in non-traditional employment arrangements, with an increase in the number of part-time workers, shift workers, workers placed on fixed-term contracts, and the increase in frequency of precarious employment practices. All these changes in the labor market and employment relationship are set to be designed to improve competitiveness. To become more competitive, the region has been called upon to dismantle its trade barriers, abolish legal monopolies, privatize state-owned enterprises, and reduce overstaffing in their bloated bureaucracies. The fact is that at the center of all this is the worker. The Caribbean Group for Cooperation in Economic Development, in its published work on workers and labor markets in the Caribbean, noted that, and I quote, workers are at the center of economic development, both as the providers of labor services and the beneficiaries of the output they produce. End of quote. It seems, therefore, that with the increasing level of globalization and the drive for greater competitiveness, workers and productivity would be a central part of our development thinking. A common belief, however, is that cheap labor and a race to the bottom could enhance global competitiveness. But the demands for protecting labor from the perils of the working environment are nothing new. In fact, it dates back to the 14th century Europe. Market forces would naturally have dictated that the shortages of labor at that time would encourage the demand for higher wages and better working conditions. But the king's response to these free market conditions was to issue a proclamation requiring everybody to accept the same wages and instituting stiff penalties for workers refusing to work, for leaving a job in search of higher pay, and for an offer of higher wages by an employer. From its inception in 1919, the ILO recognized the importance of developing labor standards for the eradication of labor conditions involving injustice, hardships, and privation. According to the ILO, international labor standards, and I quote, contribute to the possibility of lasting peace, help to mitigate potentially adverse effects of international market competition, and help the progress of international trade. End of quote. In the last 20 years, the ILO has focused its mandate on the concept of decent work. The aim is not simply to create jobs, but to create jobs that are of acceptable quality. The challenge today, according to the ILO, is, and I quote, to devise social and economic systems which ensure basic security and employment while remaining capable of adaptation to rapidly changing circumstances in a highly competitive global market. End of quote. Indeed, a calculus of inequality bedevils the region, since we have not seen the elimination of unfair competition based on oppressive working conditions. Labor standards and international trade should be linked from the starting point of a recognition of the dignity of labor, which, as the Philadelphia Declaration stated, should not be considered a commodity. Guy Kerr, professor of labor law at the University of Paris, noted that it was the rejection of labor as a commodity that led to the abolition of slavery, or closer to our time, to the rejection of forced labor as unacceptable. In this new global ideology, the WTO does not see the issue of labor standards as falling within its remit, and concludes that some countries sees it as little more than a smokescreen and an attempt by industrial nations to undermine the comparative advantage of low-wage trading partners. So that trade and investment, like sugar, still leaves a significant power asymmetries and economic inequalities between the developed and developing world. And in the words of Sir Sridhar, reinforces the historically determined inequalities which have traditionally governed the relationship between the two groups of countries. What, therefore, ought to be the strategies of the region to achieve global competitiveness? In debating the tactics necessary for regional leaders to close the cycle of power brought on by globalization, Nettleford noted that for half a millennium, we have had to confront the forces that have kept us on the margins of human-scale development. That struggle continues, but this time, we will not have to withdraw our labor and undermine the economic foundation of slavery, nor will we have to rely on the militancy of the trade union movement to use the weapon of strike and the adversarial nature of our collective bargaining process to demand higher wages and better working conditions as we did under colonialism. At an ILO-sponsored workshop on wages, crisis, and economic recovery, the conclusion was that income inequality was at the root of the recent global crisis. The workshop reported, and I quote, "Low wages and increased inequality depressed aggregate demand and prompted monetary policy to react by maintaining low interest rates. Cheap credit, in turn, allowed private household and corporate debt to increase far beyond sustainable levels." End of quote. The global imperatives will require a regional response to reforming the labor markets to achieve higher levels of flexibility and competitiveness, and redefining the relationship at the workplace with the objective of facilitating greater degree of efficiency and productivity. The alternative is not to oppose globalization, for we are not modern-day Luddites, but to devise strategy best able to achieve the objectives of growth and competitiveness. The subprime financial crisis of 2007, which became the global economic crisis, was never the result of wage developments and labor market regulations, but they have become the focus of our solutions simply because they are part of the neoliberal pro-capital distributional policies. And so, from a policy perspective, regional governments must devise the policy options that ensure that the prospect for economic growth, this time, is not constructed on the backs of an oppressed working class. This, therefore, requires a shift in policy focus to pro-labor distributional policies. The ILO, in a paper on wage-led growth, concepts, theories, and policies published in 2012, advocated for the introduction of pro-labor policies. It says, and I quote, "to strengthen the welfare state, labor market institutions, labor unions, and the ability to engage in collective bargaining. Pro-labor policies are also associated with increased unemployment benefits higher minimum wages, and a higher minimum wage relative to the median wage, end of quote. Inherent in the pro-labor policy is a wage-led growth strategy, a policy-oriented concept prominently used by UNCTAD since 2010. From a wage-led growth strategy, Engelbert Stockhammer from the Kingston University in London argued that countries would benefit from higher consumption because of the propensity to consume out of wage income, higher GDP, and faster capital accumulation, productivity enhancement, and faster productivity growth. There are obviously some various behavioral factors which would have to be considered, such as the propensity to consume by the various income groups, the sensitivity of entrepreneurs to changes in profit margins, the sensitivity of exporters and importers to changes in cost, as well as the likely impact on the various components of aggregate demand. But in a 2012 ILO working paper in the Conditions of Work Employment series, the authors concluded that wage-led growth strategies contributed substantially to the economic recovery in many countries. Jayata Ghosh, professor of economics at Nehru University in New Delhi, while acknowledging that wage-led strategies can more readily apply to developed countries with strong institutions to affect the labor market, pointed to 5 important elements of such a strategy in developing countries with large informal sectors. These would include directing resources to the sector in which the poor work, such as agriculture and informal activities, ensuring the viability of informal production through better access to institutional credit to farmers and other small producers, technological improvements and integration into supply chain and marketing, increase public employment in infrastructural work and improve the bargaining power of workers, providing much better social protection, and increasing and focusing on the public delivery of wage goods such as housing, health, education, and nutrition. The macroeconomic benefits, according to Professor Ghosh, are significant. These include, and I quote, positive implications for the growth process, more stable economic expansion based on increase in home markets, and more emphasis on productivity growth, thereby generating a high road to industrialization. At the micro level, the region, the Caribbean region, can share its own experience on the benefits of the high road approach. Case studies done throughout the Caribbean show those enterprises which have adopted this high road approach have been able to achieve high levels of productivity and competitiveness. They set about to ensure the establishment of structures and processes at the workplace which facilitate information sharing, communication, transparency, equity, participative management, and productivity. This approach has the potential to resolve important social and economic issues, encourage good governance, advance social and industrial peace and stability, and boost economic progress. It also promotes consensus building and democratic involvement among the main stakeholders in the world of work. The study was done in 15 Caribbean companies across 8 distinct sectors: banking and finance, hospitality and tourism, manufacturing, distribution and marketing, information and communication technology, services, utilities, mining and conglomerates, and multi-sector enterprises. The study was undertaken by the International Labour Organization Caribbean Office through its program for the promotion of management labor cooperation, PROMALCO. The outcome of the study noted that the central strategy for achieving improved productivity, competitiveness, and sustainability of Caribbean enterprises is through the promotion of mutually beneficial workplace partnerships between trade union workers and management, and the promotion of greater participation in the enterprise by workers, end of quote. It showed that the competitiveness of the region was achieved, and I quote, based on innovation in products and processes, total quality orientation, improved human resource quality, better working organization and conditions, enhanced capacity to adapt to constantly changing economic environment and labor management partnerships, end of quote. The study revealed the following. 1, that the initial vision and leadership came from the top of the organization. 2, that work was organized to empower employees to use their judgment and function as a team. 3, developing the capabilities of the employees, including self-management and problem-solving skills. 4, performance management procedures to monitor progress, assess the development of skills, and identify areas for further development. 5, getting involved in communities with workers and their families, suppliers, etc. And 6, alignment between people management and market business strategies. The study noted that there was much focus on the development of and improvements in the relationship between management and union. It observed that, and I quote, a number of companies have achieved significant value added from their efforts to improve union management relationships, end of quote. The study concluded that the development and increasing pursuit of the high road approach required a substantial shift in the paradigm of management. Enterprise managers have increasingly had to abandon older theories about an exclusive and absolute right to manage for a new approach which emphasizes communication and concern with the social and physical well-being of people at work. For an enterprise to continuously innovate and adapt to changes, it must have the competent, skilled, motivated, and dedicated people who are working together in an atmosphere of mutual respect, trust, confidence, and collaboration, and that human and social capital are the sources of the long-term competitive advantages of the enterprise. I conclude with the recognition that throughout our history, the collective genius of the Caribbean people have been able to survive, in Nettleford's words, the suffering and severance, whether in chatteldom, indentureship, or colonialism, and have shaped designs for social living. But as he was quick to remind us, that it is in the post-independence generation, as legatees, who have all but squandered the inheritance, resulting in obscenities of crime and violence, a debilitating poverty and chronic unemployment. A post-emancipation period, he said, which now looks like a golden era. But there's a remarkable creative diversity in our people, which Ralph Gonsalves argued can ill afford the enthronement of pessimism. If we are to conquer the new imperium, we must identify the common humanity which speaks to our quest for equality, justice, and dignity on the global stage. The centrality of labor, if we are to learn from our history, must encapsulate the new conception of governance, particularly among small states, as we are all are in the Anglophone Caribbean. By designs, our policies must therefore reflect a pro-labor emphasis. Globalization, like its predecessors, must never again be allowed to settle, conquer, or exploit our labor. As Sir Sridhar so fervently argued, we owe it to ourselves to be able to answer without shame to future generations when they ask what it was that we did when the fate of the world was in the balance. Thank you very much.
You, like me, must agree that was food for thought. We now reach the stage I will let him rest for a little while, but you may have coined up your questions. We are at the stage of question and answer, and there is so much, I think, that we would need to clarify, possibly, because we've heard a lot. There is a roving mic in the middle, so if you are to ask a question, then you would go to that mic, or it may be brought to you.
I am going to be the opening party. I'm going to make some comments, which I would like Brother Daniel to respond. And it's starting from the standpoint going way back to the ILO both in 1990. And whenever I hear that year, it brings me back to the period in the history of the development of trade unions in the Caribbean area. It was in 1919 and 1921, I think in Jamaica, that the trade union ordinance was passed to give legal status to trade unions, because hitherto trade unions were considered illegal organizations. So it was not surprising that with the birth of the ILO, correspondingly, there was this development in the region that gave rise to the legalization of trade unions. But I also want to take Danny back to a number of scenarios. And one I think you would be aware of is the whole question of the CCL's document in 1987, which was a response to the Nassau understanding, which was the heads of government meeting in Nassau, where they more or less relegated the role of labor only to negotiate wage increases, nothing else. There was a trade union training program, and coming out of that, there was a document that spoke to the trade union program for the economic transformation of the Caribbean, where it indicated that it could not be the responsibility of the governments alone, the trade unions alone, or the employers alone, that it needed the collaborative, organized participation of all to look at the whole question of the economic transformation. Now, Brother Danny would know that trade unions had an audience with our heads of government, and again that started in 1987 and continued, and I'm not sure whether in fact it is still going on today, but it used to be a feature at all the annual meetings of the heads of government that trade unions were able to interact with our heads of government in terms of the development of our Caribbean region. We are not having that again today because that level of consultation seems to be going to the side. What I was concerned about is that there was some developments worldwide that had its impact on us in the region. And I'm speaking in terms of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the United States, which created the financial crisis. And the trade unions, internationally and locally, offered a suggestion to ensure that there would be a cushioning in the event that there was a repeat. And that was the suggestion of the financial transaction tax, where those international financial institutions would be taxed, so even in case their policies give rise to this economic crisis again, that would be cushioned by the contribution that they have made. Now, I come down now, as I said, I was making some comments I want you to react to. I come down now to local, right? In an editorial in the Dominica Chronicle, May 10th, it spoke to the era of low-impact trade unions. But what struck me in that editorial was the statement accepted by the editor that government and employers routinely frustrate trade unions. That is, they don't want the movement to grow. And we have a situation, and I can speak on behalf of my organization, we have a situation where a dispute in relation to port workers that was declared in 2002 is yet to be finalized in 2013. Sometimes it's based on the posture of lawyers that are involved. But I am saying it cannot be right for us to have a situation like that. Because as is said by a lot of employers, justice delayed is justice denied.
Nicholas, Dominica Trade Union. I would like to center what I'm going to say on the role of the trade unions over many decades. We are living in a period now which we have to face as reality, that globalization is here to stay, and it's going to be intensified, no matter what we do. But we've got to have plans, we've got to position ourselves, and I'm speaking as a trade unionist. The trade union movement has come a long way. We have educated people. And the same people who have been educated, our members, turn up to be in management. And they're the same ones who keep down the unions. I remember in 1979, I think it was in June, the late William Dimas, he was in Dominica, we had an audience. And he reminded us that we, as the trade unions, that we have created a monster. That is to say, we have been training workers all the time, how to conduct themselves at work, how to produce more, so that when we come to bargain, we have a table and a stand we can rest our case on. Because we do not want the employer to say, you're asking for increased wages, but here you are, these people are not producing, or they are lackadaisical and so on. And after we have trained these people, we lose them. When we should be having them on our side, helping to negotiate and other aspect of education, they move away. But we have to constantly do that. We are in another, maybe a second or third revolution. You had the revolution of 1760, from the cottage industries to bringing people under one roof and so on. This brought about the establishment of especially the British Trade Union. Now, since 1960, in the 60s, after the war, Japan decided, well, of course, they are not going to be military power, but rather economic. And they moved into automation. That is the beginning of the squeeze of the Europeans. Because then, through automation, they were able to turn more ships and more planes and so on than in the case of Britain and France and Germany shipbuilding, manual workers, it was more costly. And this set the stage from automation to what we have now, science and technology, computer age. Now, the unions have got a very serious challenge, and that is, we have to keep pace. We cannot go on strike as before, because it's a different world we are living in. But we do take strike action when we have to. What we are saying is, and I'm sure you will agree with me, where the employer is educated enough to understand that his business is not his again in today's world. His business becomes our business. Because the unions have got an interest, the worker has an interest, the government has an interest, as well as he. Just as in the case of economics, you don't speak of land, labor, and capital anymore. You have the entrepreneur, component, which is a very important component. So instead of 3, you're talking of 4. So it's a shifting, we are living in a shifting situation where the paradigm that we operated on yesterday is a different one, and it will continue to shift. One must not blame the union or to say the union is weak. Maybe the unions are wiser now. And we understand the economic situation as nationals in most countries, because we are not under the colonial system anymore. And therefore you look at your entrepreneurs are usually homegrown and so on. So whatever capital they make, we expect it to remain in their country and to be reinvested. It don't always happen because you have a few guys who are, wise enough, they think they must send their money to other places and so on. So what I'm saying in closing is, the unions have been doing its utmost best. It has been training these people. In fact, I think the worst enemy of the worker is the worker himself. I'm speaking from experience. In that way, you fight for the workers and then they don't even want to come to the meetings, although they are paying their dues. You have to go to them, and even then they make shortcuts. So tell your time, but the employer know you are in the union. You are paying your dues, why make shortcuts? So these are the things we are saying, that we have the challenge, not only with the employer, but the very worker that we are fighting for. And we need to change that. By changing that perception, especially those who are in higher wage brackets, it's the unions that cause them to have those education today. The union fought for them to be educated. There was a time only those who had money could vote. The union fought for that, and people don't understand that and realize that. And these are the very people, when the unions take action, saying, oh, the unions again. When the union becomes, more realistic and look at things in a more sober way, then they say the unions are weak. So we have to keep a balance between what people may say about us as weak and what we perceive to be realistic. And this is where the unions, not only in Dominica, but in the world stands today. But in some cases, when things are so broad, regardless to how hard it is, then the workers have got to come out and strike, which is really a shame, but you can't get blood out of stones. So this is what I have to contribute.
I would just say in response to the point that you and Curtis made, that I suppose one of the things which influenced me to leave the trenches and go into academia is the difficulty I had in trying to reach the worker and to get an understanding from the worker about the realities of the times. That I often had a difficulty having them come to the realization that you can't get more from less. That if I say to you, but the company cannot afford it, it doesn't make me a management person. It is based on some objective basis. And I recognize that understanding is not likely to come in the heat of the moment, in the context of the time, at the workplace. If you take them out of that environment and take them into a training institution, you get a better understanding, you get a reasoning from them. So it is not that they lack the ability or the capacity to reason, because they have it. It's simply that maybe just the circumstances in which you're trying to do it is too expedient for them to understand, and that we need to try it elsewhere. That is one of the factors that influenced me to make the shift into the academia into training and education to see if I can get a level of understanding and consciousness built into them. But when they sit around the bargaining table, it is not seen as a fight between management and workers. And I stress that. And Francis made the point earlier about a September engagement that we're going to be having. It is about building cooperation. If you don't cooperate, you're going to die. Right? And so the part of what I certainly hope to spend the rest of my time doing is really trying to get workers to understand that the relationship between management and workers must be one of cooperation rather than confrontation. That doesn't mean that you won't have differences. We have to find ways to deal with those differences. But the central core of that relationship must be built upon commonality of interest. Because there's more that unite the workers and management that actually divide them.
Heard from the trade unions and the persons involved in education, academia. What about the ordinary worker like myself? Any questions?
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I want to begin by saying that, well, a lot of food for thought. You know, the guest lecturer, a lot of food for thought. You know, he took a lot of notes. And okay, what I would say in one sentence, you've launched a serious attack on globalization. And when I listened to one of the union representatives who spoke a while ago, as though he took, although he didn't explain why he came to that position, but he said that almost like globalization is inevitable. It's something we have to live with, as the last union rep. But you launched a serious attack on it, really saying, well, boy, this thing should really go in the garbage kind of history. Okay, so for me, you know, I have an open mind. There are some pluses in globalization, there are some minuses in globalization. The question is, what is the niche that Caribbean people, you know, what is in globalization that Caribbean people that is positive and helpful to Caribbean people? That is the question I think that we have to answer. You know, that is not all bad. We have a lot of bad in it, so you take the bad out, but there's some element that is good. So that's the first thing. But what I found though was, you know, I'm not clear on your vision of Caribbean development. You know, your vision. For example, you know, as far as the Caribbean development is concerned, at the centerpiece of it, for example, is the CSME, CARICOM Single Market and Economy. And you didn't mention that at all. So I'm not really clear on your view on it. Do you think it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, or do you think it is totally irrelevant? You know, and when one is talking about development in the Caribbean, you cannot be oblivious to the CSME, given the enormous investment of intellectual and financial resources. So that's my third point. And then the other thing I want to say is that I take the point about not getting more out of less. I mean, that's a fundamental principle. But it reminded me of the days of this fellow, Christopher Columbus. All of us learned about that from primary school, high school. That he reached the east by sailing west. You know what I'm saying? So there's always these, you know, contradictions, you know, that one has to juxtapose. That is not, one might felt, I mean, probably that is why when Columbus was sailing, the only prisoners he could get to sail with him. Because all the learned people at the time felt that he was crazy. How can you go east by sailing west? But I mean, he did do that, you know, so this is the kind of thing I want to say. My final point is, you know, well, of course, I know that Dr. Several do that I believe that you have to give us an anchor at some point, maybe not this year, but next year. Because from that foundation, that rejection of globalization, you know, the vision going forward for the Caribbean, devoid of globalization, that vision going forward, I think that is what a lot of us who are involved in the business of planning and development, I mean, I work in the government machinery, you know, and one is always looking for new ideas because we're really in a serious battle, you know, trying to improve the standard of living and you know, make people better off and those kind of things, and the collaboration necessary. So it's always good to hear from the intellectuals. So I think we need an anchor from, you know, when having rejected globalization, what is the road ahead now? You have to give some thought to that also.
You're sending me back to the drawing board. Well, I perhaps did it badly, poorly, so I apologize. I spoke about the ideology of globalization. And I think I just attempted to point to the fact that globalization is not devoid of an ideology. And the ideology is no dissimilar from the ideology which was ruled the society for years. I think I also made the point that the solution is not to destroy globalization because we're not modern day Luddites. Did I say that? Yeah. So therefore it is not, so the opposition to globalization doesn't mean that we're going to destroy. But you're correct, there are opportunities within it that we need to identify and to maximize. And I think that what I attempted to say is that with regard to the ideology of globalization, which I reject the ideology of globalization, with regard to the fact that I know I can't turn back globalization, because it is needed, then how it is that the Caribbean must respond to that, because at the heart of it, it's about competitiveness, and at the heart of competitiveness, it's about labor. How can we therefore achieve that competitiveness in the context of globalization? And that is how the solution about the high-road approach and all of that. But whilst I did not use the term CSME, I thought I spoke sufficiently about regional integration. To make you recognize that the prescription is a regional prescription, and therefore to mean collaboration beyond what is now defined as the CSME to the kind of a new regionalism which I mentioned that's now taking place in Europe and the United States and Asia. Because you must recall that 20 or 30 years ago, we used to have a rejection of what we call cultural imperialism. You remember that? Cultural imperialism. When we thought that the culture of other countries, other regions of the world was dominating our culture. That was in the days when we had the dishes and mass media. That situation has become exponentially worse. And there's not a whisper about cultural imperialism. We now crave for other people's culture. And the point we're making is that this new regionalism, this regional integration, must involve that as well. Not only the economics of it, but the cultural side of it. Because that is what Europe recognized and Asia recognized, that the new regionalism was there. And if they are much stronger than us, I want to defend their thing, then who shall we? So the real point is that, yes, CSME, but beyond that, into a kind of a new regionalism and a recognition that the ideology of globalism is no different from the ideology of slavery. Right? And whilst you could have mash up slavery and mash up colonialism, and I wouldn't even say we're not able to mash up globalization, but then I think going there yet, because I don't know. But I'm just saying that seek the best opportunities out of globalization and make sure that at the center of that is labor and the policies, regional policies that define the whole field.
I would like to come at this from a more geographical perspective, in that globalization isn't only about ideology, it's about very real facts of how the world operates, where it causes a so-called contraction because things happen in distant places and often seemingly disconnected that have an impact on workers in the Caribbean. so that you have something like an earthquake in Japan, but it affects a worker on a coffee estate in Jamaica because we have decided in the interests of better markets to push, say, something like Blue Mountain coffee to Japan as a preferential market. Blue Mountain coffee is then seen as a luxury commodity. And after you have that earthquake and times are tough, you give up luxuries. It's what happens here when we have hurricanes, say. So that the worker in Jamaica is now very much affected by what seems to be a disconnected event. So it's not only about ideology, it's about what it means on a very real basis. And it talks other things about how we prepare our workers for resilience in a world where things come at them. We also, from the colonial period, had this perspective of us being here and our control being from outside, and things happened outside of us and we were here, and everything, you know, the goods of our labor was pushed outside. The profits went away. But what is happening now is that the labor that we have here is very much connected, and things happen much faster because of the internet, transport is that much more rapid, and so many other things. And I think that is where we have to look at for the challenges to labor, is in the geographical context, not just the ideology and what the movement meant and some of the other effects. And the other thing I'd like to throw into it is that we often just look at labor for the value that we place on remunerating workers. But in the same way that in economics we have moved away from just GDP and hardcore accounting, and we've gone into things like natural resource valuation, and we're trying to grapple with more fuller accounting systems, that the value of labor has to be much more than what we actually pay workers, but what it means for having a labor force that is motivated, that is willing to drive us to another level, to be more competitive, to reclaim our place. And the third thing is, I personally reject that CSME. I like to think I'm a Caribbean person and that there are Caribbean initiatives and we have the regional negotiating machinery. But CSME has really failed us individually as island states. I'm coming from Jamaica. I've been to Barbados. I went to Antigua, St. Kitts. I'm now here in Dominica, and I'm onward to Trinidad and to Suriname. I don't want to tell you how many currencies I've had to navigate. Let's start with that. So we can't be nice. We have to be very honest with ourselves about the things that we have set up, supposedly as enabling structures, which have not enabled us. And until we are real with ourselves about these structures and what they should and could be doing, then we're not going to get very far.
Thank you very much. I said three things. One, you're correct. CSME has not achieved its objective, but I'm not throwing the baby with the bathwater. I'm not giving up on CSME because the concept and the philosophy of regional cooperation still provides a much greater solution to individual states within the region than us trying to go individually, especially now in this global environment. The second thing is that every time we talk about what the world now represents, we speak about it from a Eurocentric point of view. 40, 50 years ago, Europe do what we want to do, we do what we want to do. Now, almost in a sense, we feel trapped that if Europe does it, if the United States does it, then that is what the world wants, so we must do it too. That seemed to me to tell me that some of what we struggle for, our independence, our culture, from things that identify us as a region, is now becoming subsumed to something that, forgive me, is quite alien to us in terms of culture and all of that. And therefore, I don't intend to surrender that sovereignty and independence to some cultural sensibilities that I not accustomed to, don't work with it. The third thing is that globalization has always been with us. The North Atlantic trade war affected us in the Caribbean. Our labor, our sugar was affected. When we had, at the end of the Second World War, taxes and oppression began to rain upon us because we had to, the United Kingdom had to build back its rubbish economy. Right? The link from Africa to Britain, the United States is globalizing, to the Caribbean is globalization. Now that's taking a different form, the technology has the thing, etc. But the globalization has always been with us. And the point I attempted to make is that in spite of all of that, there's a common thread. That inherent in all of that is hegemonic control. Somebody wants to control and dictate and determine what we do. We don't seem to be good enough to decide for ourselves. We're either too small, too far, whatever the historical circumstances are. And that is why I must tell you, only this week there are two issues which Prime Minister Shearer spoke of, which I am very proud of. One, when he said he sees no argument for him to even contemplate the Bulk Act. I applaud him for that. That is part of our Caribbean experience. And two, that he has written a letter to Britain to tell the Privy Council that Bye is the CCJ when the final code complete. What is there to prevent us from defining our own destiny and still become a part of the world? What about, used to talk about tolerance and diversity. Why can't we remain diverse in a globalized economy? Why we must follow what the Europeans and the Americans say? What, they have come, they have invaded us and imposed that upon us. We have rejected it. And now they're using globalization as a weapon to get us to follow their dictates. Believe me, I have nothing to that. Definitely nothing to that. I'd like to establish my sovereignty and independence and determine what it is that is good for we as a people. Right? And still feel part of globalization. Right? There's unity in diversity. Yes,
Sir Roberts, just before I ask the question, the point you made on the CCJ, has Jamaica decided yet?
No.
Not yet.
We're still ipping and butting.
Okay. I just want to pick your vision on how do you see the region carving out a development matrix, a development thrust, and creating a more central role for the tripartite partners. And I ask that because as a region, we've been pursuing our development through multilateral, even plurilateral arrangements, some bilaterals. We have the EPA that we have just concluded, and labor and enterprise was substantially left out of the EPA discussions. We see a repeat for CARICOM Canada, although a lot of talk has gone forward about creating a better role for the social partners. Essentially, that is not being done. I think the next big one for us is Brazil. There's already a partial scope agreement between CARICOM and Brazil. And again, we have not seen a central role for labor and enterprise. Yeah. So my concern is, it's not just at the CARICOM level, but even smaller at the sub-regional level, OECS, because we seem to be making more progress at the level of the OECS than CARICOM. So how do we sort of roll back for a moment? How do we carve out that role for labor and enterprise? Because even at the level of the POTED, we still have issues with representation of labor and enterprise. When countries go to CARICOM heads of meeting of POTED, you might find a plane load of public sector officials, and there may just be one gentleman probably representing CCL to talk on labor for the entire region. one person from CEC to talk on enterprise for the entire region. So I just want to pick your brain because basically in your presentation, you spoke about very tough word, exploitation of labor at the hands of the multinational companies and those who are pursuing their objectives at the level of the global enterprise. So probably you have some experience or some suggestions of carving out a more integrated role for labor, for enterprise in our regional and sub-regional integration movement.
I would want to believe that, first of all, labor has to organize itself much better and to become a force to be reckoned with. Because the truth is, as I mentioned, throughout our history, labor really hasn't been treated as an equal partner. Therefore, for labor to be treated as an equal partner, more so in an era in which there is a disregard for the importance of labor as an equal partner in the development process. That labor itself has to organize much better than it is doing and to become a force to reckon with. If that happens, then what it means is that the powers that be will have to sit up and listen. In the very same way that we attempted in the 70s, most of the 70s, to get the world to listen to the developing countries through South-South cooperation and things of that nature. And that is the only time that we got some attention. Other than that, nothing happened. But I'll never forget the WTO conference in Miami, when Sir Frida Kroon had to literally lose his temper to be able to get attention from the organizers of the conference to explain what the regional agenda ought to be and what ought to be matters for consideration. So, in one sense, you don't get the respect unless you have some kind of force to contend with. Economic power, political power, intellectual power, and sometimes power through the barrel of a gun. But the region, the labor movement, has to organize itself to become a potent force that forces heads of government to recognize that they are a force to be reckoned with and therefore to give them equal voice. I don't see it happening otherwise. I really don't see it happening otherwise. And the prescriptions are there. The prescriptions as to what to do. We set out in ILO documents. I went through some of them a while ago. So we know, the policy, pro-labor policies that need to be implemented, but it is not going to come on the agenda in an environment in which we believe that cheap labor is the route to prosperity.
Yes. My reflection is, I suppose, similar to one of the young ladies who spoke there a while ago, the concern about the CSME or whatever other model of integration that you may have hinted to, and whether this is gaining any traction on the ground. And I guess just outside your office, sir, Mona has put in a little pack there, right? A Hall of Fame like, where all the prime ministers who studied at UWI, their names are listed there. If you go there now, you'll see a whole heap of them. And I wonder to what extent their experience at UWI, or to what extent the model of integration, UWI itself, has impacted on having CSME gain traction. Let it have meaning to the ordinary man in the region.
And Rex, you said about the people from below. Sometimes we have to organize ourselves and get the attention that we deserve.
In fact, most times that is what happened. That if we remember all the changes in the development of Caribbean is really done by the people from below. It may have been led by middle-class intellectuals, but it began with the people from below. Yes.
Brother Roberts, I paid very close attention to your suggestion, and I think I agree to some extent, the departure from confrontation to greater cooperation. But when the world is moving at that rapid rate, and especially the next generation, the now generation, and I paid note that we spent a lot of time looking at the historical background, but I want to point to the future a bit, which is the now and young generation. How do we ignite their interest in both labor and the movement, with a view of organizing labor to be a force? When the movement seems sometimes very steeped in its ways and stagnant, the reality is that young people are the portion that is most affected by unemployment, by precarious work, by non-formal work, and more difficult to organize. If the movement is going to remain relevant, if CCL will again be a force to be reckoned with in the region, if we are not clear on some clear strategies to organize, is it even possible? I would like to hear your thoughts on how do we really move forward in that regard.
Well, it's certainly not impossible, very difficult, very challenging, and sometimes, it says conditions determine consciousness. Perhaps as get worse, it will get better. Perhaps as get worse, it will get better. But it is not beyond us. I mean, historically we have, and we need to draw on the lessons from the past. We have shown the ability to respond, to be resilient, to counter, the oppression and the exploitation, etc. We expected at this time that from those historical lessons we'd have been better organized to do the thing. It has not happened. Part of this program is an attempt to get people to recognize the importance of that. We speak about it, we try to address it, but sometimes it is the conditions which have to create the level of consciousness for people to act. And maybe these are the conditions that are just not bad enough yet.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me express my personal thanks for what I believe was your very eloquent presentation. Well, I would say firstly that things are really moving fast and maybe quicker than our own expectation. I recall being part of a group of labor leaders who attended a program at George Meany College for Labor Studies in Maryland in the mid-1990s. And during that visit, we paid visits to some of the international institutions like the IMF and the IDB. And I recall in our discussions and based on some of the points that we were putting forward as labor leaders from the Caribbean, we particularly requested for labor input in terms of being able to fashion the policies of the IMF and the IDB in their programs at the national country level. I probably would want to ask to what extent, I mean, your comments, to what extent you think, I mean, that has really taken place as we move forward. And talking about moving forward, I recall as well going to the headquarters of the AFL-CIO, just overlooking the White House. And I recall, I think that was the time when, or maybe just after the time, I think Jesse Jackson was putting himself forward for elections as a black candidate. And I recall in our question, we particularly asked the Labour leaders then about the possibility of a black person being the president of the United States. And I recall the answer that one of the leaders of the U.S. Labour indicating that not during his lifetime. And we have seen in a very short time.
Is he dead?
Well, I suppose he was a young enough guy, so I suppose he would be still alive. But we see just in a very short years afterwards that we have Obama as the president of the United States. But I say all this to indicate that really the world is moving forward. We recognize that globalization is inevitable. But my concern really is, at the national level. In fact, just recently there was I think the president of the CCL made mention of some umbrella organization of labor, and I think at maybe the OECS level, in terms of moving us forward. But I mean, while we are talking at that level, but even in Dominica at this time, we recognize, yes, globalization is inevitable. We're talking about competitiveness with regards to labor. But what are we in Dominica's labor unions doing? We have not even had a national joint TUC in Dominica. I probably would want to ask your comments where that is concerned, because if we cannot have such an organization at the national level, what we are talking about in terms of we moving forward and how we're going to deal with this globalization problem. So I think these are important issues. I probably would like if you could maybe just share some more light on that. Thank you.
Well, I said two things. I think we all know what the problems are in this, and we all know what the solutions are in this. Now, I don't know if I can answer the question as to why have we not begun to implement those solutions, but I don't have any solution different from you. We know what we need to organize ourselves. We need to organize it. Why is it not being done? There may be a myriad of reasons. Some of the personality, people just not. We're in a period now where it is very difficult, and this is regionally. It's very difficult to organize workers, their trade union function about globalization. But 20, 30 years ago, it was not so difficult. So there is a new wave that seems to be permeating the air that people are not responding. The important thing I would say is that you have to persevere. The efforts have to continue. But we have had, certainly in Jamaica, and I suspect in other Caribbean countries, we have had periods in which there have been no trade union organization. Between the passing of the Trade Union Act, courtesy in 1919 and now, we have had 2 periods when no trade union organization existed. But it is the conditions, when I come back to that Marxian notion about conditions determining consciousness, that it is the conditions, quite often, that is going to lead to the kind of action and change that we speak of. Yes.
Good evening. I'm going to change the trend of discussion away from dollars and cents, labor, conditions to that of health. I suppose you know the health of a nation is the wealth of the nation. And I did not hear you mention health as a challenge to the labor movement. Chronic non-communicable diseases is now the leading cause of morbidity and mortality of the working force, leading in the Caribbean. The prevalence of diabetes among our working people in Dominica is 18%. And diabetes is one of the top 3 leading causes of death in the region, and namely among our working force. And we know lifestyle contributes to that. Our diet, which we have adopted from the globalized trends, our lifestyle, driving around, sitting in front of the TV. I would like to put on the table that this is one challenge we can address locally in our region of counteracting some of the negative forces of globalization, i.e. our diet. The foods we grow in Dominica is much healthier for us to prevent these diseases than what we import. But we hear about the staggering cost of importing food. And I think labor forces should put that on the agenda if we are to address a number of issues, i.e. the health of our worker and also our economy. Thank you.
It has been matters of that nature. The health issue has been raised both at the collective bargaining level as well as at the policy regional level. But there may be some other imperatives which prevent that. And until labor is organized strong enough to make sure that that call for health to be a central part of the collective bargaining consideration, or to be a focus of policy prescription. To the extent that labor can get the voices heard on that matter, it is going to be treated the way it has been treated, largely ignored. Right? So it comes back to the question of how much influence organized labor can have in having these important issues. People speak glib of it. I mean, I don't think there's any politician in any part of the region who would not agree with what you just said. Why is it not implemented? Why is it not given greater focus and consideration? What are the other imperatives that are pushing that on the back burner of the agenda? And why is it that labor can't have its issue become a central imperative? What are some of the things that we have to deal with? I mean, I was saying, who pay the piper call the tune? Fast food, employment, right? Government turn a blind eye to the health issue, because there's an opportunity for employment, job, re-election. The nation suffers in the long run. The working population suffers in the long run. But what is the alternative? That again you have to deal with.
I was just about to ask, what about our own regional globalization, our institutions in helping to guide us, things like what Dr. Ricketts just mentioned. The University of the West Indies itself, the OECS, and CARICOM, what teeth do they have in guiding our regional leaders? Are our regional leaders aware, intelligent, competent enough to understand what's happening, or is this myopic view of my island, my country, as you mentioned, my election? And does that contribute to that regional push to understand what needs to be done, that we can be globalized, but we can be disciplined within our own area, not to lose out in anything? If there's a contract out for something and you have a foreign company bidding, who guides us that a percentage of the workers coming into that country must be that 5%? And 95% must be from outside. 95% must be in and 5% from outside. Is there anything guiding this? And does the university or the trade union or the labor section that you work in give guidance? And can it be mandatory? Or are these institutions just with the technical people but they don't have any teeth? And how much our politicians understand the impact of national policies and the social policies and all the issues that affect us, that we can have some monitoring network to give some level of monitoring and discipline that what you're doing is wrong, and the checks and balances. Sometimes I listen to the regional meetings and I don't know where it goes, and we hear these nice talks and they come back. We don't see any impact in what's happening.
I've no doubt that we have some of the brightest minds in governments across the region, no doubt about it. And we spoke about the imperatives. And sometimes our leaders are aware of some other considerations that we may not be aware of and have to make some very serious choices. So for example, a government may be faced with a choice of saying, no, the investor from us I'm prepared to invest $100 million, but it is going to mean that 50% of the labor has to be brought in by me. They say no to that. He goes elsewhere. You lose the investment. You lose the possibility of employment. You're sometimes faced with those stark choices. Right? And there may be other considerations. They think that your labor laws are too rigid, so nobody wants to invest there. So invariably, these are some of the tough choices that our political leaders are faced with. There are also other considerations, what is known as political expediency. If I do this, how long will it take to come to fruition? It may take 5 to 10 years. Can I wait 5 to 10 years? People want to see immediate result. So let me go for the expedient route, something that them can say happen tomorrow so that I can get re-elected. Sometimes those are factors that are part of the dialogue and the conversation and get into the policy. And it's not peculiar to the Caribbean. I think it's peculiar right across the world. I think that no people, it's human nature. I mean, there are exceptional persons, of course, who take positions that are much more encompassing national interest than self-interest. But there are so many factors sometimes. We seem to believe that our politicians are bereft of common sense and can't seem to make right decisions. But they are bright people, I mean, who understand the thing. But there are some other, I don't know, there's some considerations that I suspect are influenced by self-interest and of expediency, or perhaps just the reality of what the alternatives and options are, especially when you're competing for, and this is how we know we come to the point about this race to the bottom, because everybody wants job for their people, everybody wants investment and all of that. And if it means that what stands between you and that investment is whether 50 or 100 people is employed, you may make the decision, well, let me take 50 rather than 100. At least I get the investment, and 50 people get the job. If I don't, I lose everything. Some tough practical considerations outside of the other things that I spoke of, or sometimes the choices that our leaders are facing.
One thing which is true is that Dominicans, Danny, know how to get blood out of stone. And they will keep you here till 4 o'clock tomorrow morning. I have to intervene. Let me now call on Ms. Kimon Joseph to deliver a vote of thanks on behalf of the National Bank of Dominica and the University of the West Indies Open Campus Dominica site. Ms. Joseph.
Your Excellency, the President, Mr. Eliot T. Williams and Mrs. Williams, Mr. Michael Bird, General Manager of NBD, Dr. Francis Sever, Director Designate of the Open Campus Country Sites, Mr. Danny Roberts, the Head of the Hugh Lawson Shearer Trade Union Education Institute, Mr. Felix Wilson, Acting Head of the UWI Open Campus Site, Mrs. Susan Piper, the Marketing Manager of the NBD, students of the UWI Open Campus, staff and of both the UWI Open Campus and the NBD, and members of the audience and the media representatives. Good evening. On behalf of the UWI Open Campus, I wish to thank His Excellency and Mrs. Williams for attending our event this evening. We're very pleased that you could be here and that you agreed to come. I'd like to thank our presenter, Mr. Danny Roberts, who spoke very, very competently on the cooperation and improved methods of communication which are better alternatives for dealing with the global competitiveness. And he mentioned that globalization must not be allowed to conquer our labor. And I found that very interesting, and I thank him for his presentation. I'd like to thank the National Bank of Dominica for its partnership in this event. We appreciate your sponsorship and the helpful attitude of your staff. I'd like to especially thank Mr. Bird, Mrs. Piper, and Ms. Scotland, who worked with me through planning this process, and to the staff of the NBD who are present here, who came early and were helping from the very beginning. Thank you very much. Pastor Randy Rodney gave the opening prayer, and I'd like to thank him for that. He has already left because he expressed that he had other obligations, but he's always very enthusiastic and ready to help, and I thank him very much for that. The Fortune Hotel staff, who are always very professional and very accommodating, we are very grateful. And we're also very grateful that they've agreed to allow us to use this conference room for all the lectures that we'll have for the entire year of 2013 for free. We thank Kyrie FM for the live broadcast and for the discount that we get on bringing this educational program to the Dominican community. We thank you, our gracious audience, who have been here with us. We thank you for your attentiveness and for the lively discussion that we had. In fact, we had to cut it off because it was so lively. We thank the media representatives. The majority of the media houses are always in attendance at our events, our lectures, and the other things that we do at Open Campus, and we're very, very grateful for that. We thank them for their support at our events and our activities, and we encourage them to continue to come so that people who cannot be here will always know what the University of the West Indies Open Campus is doing and what our partners are helping us to do, our partners like the National Bank. If I've forgotten anybody, I apologize. I thank you all, and may God bless you.